Okay, good evening, gentlemen. We are making our way slowly but surely, and hopefully the main thing is understanding what we're saying. We're making our way through the first chapter of the Tanya. We are actually in the middle of the what we would call in the Hasidic parlance the beer part of the chapter, the actual meat of the first chapter. If you'll recall, the whole beginning section of the first chapter was a series of questions about multiple topics, most of which don't get answered until much later. And then we began talking about the souls of the Jew. We were talking about the nature of the soul. We said that every Jew has two souls, whether they are righteous, whether they are wicked. And we've been speaking for the past couple of weeks, we have been speaking about the nature of the first soul. We said the first soul comes from the Klippa and Sitra Achra. And these last 2 weeks, we've basically just been explaining what those words mean. What do we mean by Klippa? What do we mean by Sitra Achra? These are terms from Jewish mysticism, from the Kabbalah. We spoke about, our conclusion last week was that Klippa is the idea of I am. There is a spiritual reality that God creates, a spiritual existence whose nature is to say I am, rather than God is. And as we explained at length for the past 2 weeks, there's no such thing, really, as a neutral concept of existence. There's no such thing as something that just exists, because existence is not freely available. As we said last week, it's not like there's a big fish tank with no walls that we call existence, and then you just run into different things in this tank, like there's us, and there's the table, and there's God, and there's all just a bunch of things in this fish tank. On the contrary, at first there is no such thing called existence. And God creates it. He lends existence to other things. So in other words, there is no such thing as just existing. There is no existence freely available for things to participate in or to take. All existence comes from only one place. It all comes from God. So in other words, it's not neutral. It's not like I exist and God exists with the same existence. On the contrary, all existence is what you could think about it as ordered or directed existence. Existence isn't neutral. Existence is godly. God is not just another thing that exists. He is the ground and source of all existence. And so the very nature of existence is God's existence, is the divine reality. All things that exist, all things that come into reality are reflecting a divine reality. However, because God, for reasons that are mysterious and will only become obvious in the Tanya in chapter 36, as we mentioned last week, which is much, much later, God wants things to exist that are not aware that all existence is godly existence. I'll say again, even though all existence is godly existence, this is the truth of all existence, God makes things that are unaware of or that fundamentally deny this fact. In other words, God creates something called, please turn off all cell phones. Thank you. Silence all cell phones. God creates something called neutral existence. He creates something called objective reality, quote unquote, neutral existence, where things seem to just exist. This is called the world of the klippas, the world of klippa, which klippa means peel or shell. Why is it called a peel or shell? Because just as the banana peel is created as an independent entity by removing the fruit, it's eating the banana that creates the banana peel, because until you eat the banana, the whole thing is just a banana, right? When you tell someone, pass me the banana, you don't say, pass me the banana and the peel. You say, pass me the banana. The peel is part of the banana. It's only when you eat the banana that the peel becomes a peel, right? Similarly, the klipa, its very existence is based on the denial of its true reality, of its true purpose, which is simply to reflect godliness, to be an extension of the divine, which is the nature of all existence, right? Since the klipa is in denial, is estranged from its own true reality by God's will, not because it did something wrong. That's how God made it. God made such things that they are estranged from the truth of their own existence, as we discussed last week. And this is called klipa. And with the eating of the fruit in the Garden of Eden, as we discussed at great length over the past couple of weeks, that reality became part of it's, so to speak, mixed with divine realities to create the one objective reality in which we perceive ourselves to exist. Why do we perceive ourselves to exist in one objective, neutral reality where existence is a neutral term and not divine? When I say the table exists, I'm not making any comment about God, apparently. Why is that the case? Because we live in a world that is full of klipos, and the very soul that is evaluating this world is also of the klipos. This first soul of the Jew comes from this place. It comes from the place of I am, of things that say, I exist. That's the first soul of the Jew. And then we said the Sitra Achra, we said there's a distinction between Klippa and Sitra Achra, which we'll discuss more in later chapters. For now, we're going to basically treat them as more or less the same thing. There is a distinction, but the Sitra Achra means the other side. So the Klippa is the shell, right? Which is things that deny their own existence as a divine existence, as a Klippa. And then you have a Sitra Achra. A Sitra Achra means the other side. You have the side of holiness, and then you have the other side. What's interesting is that the other side is everything that doesn't reflect the divine reality, right? Is the other side. That's why it's called the other side, right? Because you only have, in other words, if you call it good and evil, a terminology which comes from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, which is what mixed all the klippas and everything together, the implication is a neutral point of view. I have one thing called good, I have another thing called evil, and it's all just neutral. They both just exist, right? Whereas when you step out of that paradigm to judge it from the outside, right? When you're talking about, but what's the true reality, right? When good and evil just look like that because we exist within the world after they ate from the tree, right? But what about the truth of these things, which is the perspective of the Kabbalah, right? It's the secrets of Torah as they come into our reality as we can study them, right? What's the truth of these things? The truth of these things is that you have holiness, which means things that reflect that God is the true existence, things that know the truth, that the only existence is divine existence, and then you have everything else. In other words, it's not like good and evil where there's a balanced choice between two things that appear to both exist neutrally, right? Because we now know that's the perspective of the Klippa, right? You have holiness, which is the truth, and then you have the rest. You have everything else, the other side, right? The other side, which is everything that does not acknowledge the true reality, everything that does not reflect this true reality. Thus, this explains, as we said last week, and we were struggling with and trying to appreciate last week, this is why even the tzaddik, even the perfectly righteous individual, and even the most wicked individual, both have a soul that comes from the Klippa and Sitra Achra, which is their biological life, as we're going to discuss more this week. They each have this vitality, they each have this I am, right? Tanya says, from the righteous to the wicked, every Jew has this soul, right? In other words, the perfectly righteous, to be perfectly morally righteous, makes no difference to this fundamental reality of the I am, right? Which is not a moral form of evil. As we were discussing last week, there's different types of evil. It's not a moral type of evil. It may not even be evil at all in a moral sense, right? It's just the way God made the world, right? But it is a denial of the divine. In that sense, it's evil, right? In that sense, it's the Sitra Achra, which is sometimes translated, by the way, as the demonic, which I think is a bad translation simply because in English the connotations are all wrong, as we're going to find out. That means a cheeseburger is demonic, which is taken. Maybe it is, but that just means you have to expand your definition of demonic until the most mundane things in the world are all demonic. So I don't know how useful that word is. The Sitra Achra is the opposite of holiness, the other side. And even the great tzaddikim, because they have an I am, one soul is still an animal soul, is still an I am, is still a self-centered existence. It's still an existence based in itself, right? There's me, and I participate in a neutral reality called existence, right? That is shared by both the wicked and the righteous and everyone in between. It's not a moral issue, it's an existential issue. It's not about being a good or a bad person, it's about being an existence that is not a reflection of the divine, right? It's the fundamental state of saying I exist, right? Where exist implies something that anyone can do. It doesn't mention God. It doesn't mention the divine. That is the state of Klippa and Sitra Achra, and all of us have a soul like this. And spoiler, the Alter Rebbe is going to say again much later that this is the standard conscious soul of every Jew. In other words, this is, for the most part, who I'm talking to right now, who we live with most of our lives, this is who we are, which is not so shocking. It's pretty straightforward to realize, because most of the time we think of ourselves as I am, not as I am a reflection of the divine. The natural state, quite literally, of the human animal, of the human as a biological being, as we'll hopefully discuss more tonight, is to say I am. And it's not a bad thing. It's a neutral thing. It is what it is, as they say. It's the way God made the world for a reason, as we'll discuss. I think that is a very short but a thorough summary of what we have been discussing. So I think if anyone wants to review more and get into more details on any of the things we've discussed, they can check out the classes of the last 2 weeks, which have basically been on the same topic. Last week was a rewording of the first class, so we can get comfortable sort of within these concepts. And what I'm hoping, and as I've now said I think 3 weeks in a row, what I'm hoping is that because we've spent the time to ground ourselves well in these notions, moving forward we'll have a much better chance of understanding or getting something out of what the Alter Rebbe is saying. Because if you don't have this groundwork, it's going to become much rougher going further on. So we spent a lot of time delving into very few words in the Tanya, mainly Klippa and Sitra Achra, which will be the topic of whole chapters later in the Tanya. But in order to do this in the order the Alter Rebbe intended, where we're starting from the most basic foundations and building up the Tanya from chapter 1. So this is fundamental to understanding from chapter 1 what the Alter Rebbe is talking about. Okay, we're actually going to read a few more words of the Tanya tonight, God willing, and we're going to discuss them. We're going to keep talking about this same soul, which, by the way, is also called the animal soul, as we'll see, commonly called the Nefesh HaBahamis in common Chabad parlance, although, as you'll see, it also has other names. Other things that we call it. And the name animal soul is itself perhaps somewhat misleading, can also be misleading if you don't know what it's talking about. So we'll hopefully get to all that. Okay. Let us read. We are on page 10 of the Tanya in the Hebrew, page 4 in the Standard English translation. We are actually on the word Vehi. The line starts Nefesh Achas, Mitzad HaKlippa VaSitra Achra, about 6 lines up from the bottom of page 10 in the Hebrew text of Tanya. The line starts Nefesh Achas, and it ends Vehia Mislabeshes. That's where we're up to. In the English, this is... It's the sentence starting, there is one soul, in the last paragraph of page 4. Okay. So this sentence began, well, it's a long sentence, but we were just saying earlier in this sentence, there are two souls. One soul comes from the Klippa and the Sitra Achra, which we've now defined and explained. Vehi hamislabeshes bedam ha'adam. And it is enclosed within the blood of the human being, within the blood of a man, lahachyes haguf, to enliven the body, or to vivify the body. Ukedichsiv, as the verse says, ki nefesh habasar bedam hi, the life of the flesh is in the blood, which is from Vayikra. Okay, let's pause here. This animal soul, this vitality of the Klippa, this spiritual I am, which God creates, encloses within the blood, here we're speaking of the literal blood of the body, to give life to the body, right? As it says, the nefesh habasar, the soul of the flesh, is in the blood, right? So this concept of soul and blood are connected in the pasuk, right? And actually, this has halachic ramifications. It has to do with shechting animals, right? What do we consider a live animal, dead animal? What's considered the life blood? It all is all connected to the laws of shechting, of shchita. This is actually a concept which has halachic ramifications. That's what the Torah is talking about in context there. So, first of all, let's understand these few words. The first point to understand, and again here you have to take sort of 2 steps back to really see the whole picture before you can zoom in on what the Alter Rebbe is saying precisely here. Just as we step back to understand the concepts of Klippa and Sitra Achra generally, before understanding what it means to say the soul is from the place of I am, of independent existence, right? This spiritual entity, which is called an independent existence, is enclosed in the blood. Now, to understand what we mean by enclosed in this case, which is a very common Hasidic term, hislavshus is used over and over again in the Maimarim, the idea of enclothing, right? Which the word is itself obviously metaphorical, puts you in mind of clothes, but again, if you don't have background, that can also be misleading. A lot of these metaphors can be taken the wrong way if you don't learn properly. So let's learn properly. The first thing to understand is that in the view of Chassidus, which is actually the common ancient view, in other words, this was the way of looking at the world until 500 years ago, almost universally, almost everywhere in the world, by everyone always. In modern times, we've gotten the way of looking at the world has changed significantly, whether for better or for worse, or neither, or neutral, is a fascinating topic I can talk about for many hours, but it would interrupt our class, so we won't get into it. The old way of looking at our world that everyone shared, and which the Tanya takes as axiomatic, it takes as a given, right? And it receives this from, there's many reasons for this. First of all, it seems quite obviously to be the perspective of the sages in the Talmud, for one thing, right? For another, it's codified by the Rambam into halacha and different things. It comes down in different aspects of Jewish law. For a third thing, the Chassidus Chabad is very respectful of the ancient Jewish philosophies, even when we disagree with them. As we'll see in chapter 2, the ancient Jewish philosophers, like the Rambam in Moreh Nevuchim, like Rav Saadia Gaon, like the Kuzari, Chassidus is very in the realm of rationality, which Chassidus says is a limited realm. There's things beyond that realm. But within the realm of rationality, we're very diffident, we're very respectful, we step aside, and generally, unless there's a specific reason to disagree, we follow the ancient Jewish philosophers in the realm of rationality, believing that the ancient Jewish philosophers had the highest and the best possible rationality, probably. It's probably one of the reasons why. So for all of these reasons, we side with the ancient position. By the way, there are some things in Chassidus which are very modern and do not side with the ancient position at all, as we'll see in chapter 2, which is very interesting. We don't always follow the oldest mode of interpretation, but in many things we do. So with all that prefacing matter, what do the ancient philosophers say? They say that a physical thing doesn't mean totally devoid of the spiritual. I'll say again, a physical thing, physical matter, right? Let's say the liquid of blood that's running through your veins right now, for example. A physical object is not totally devoid of the spiritual. In other words, the very term when you say a physical object, we don't mean in pure distinction with the spiritual. We don't mean something that all of the spiritual has been set aside. On the contrary, we don't really believe in Chassidus. The worldview of the Alter Rebbe doesn't believe there is such a thing as matter without spirit. There's no such thing, which is actually a very rational position. I'm going to try my best not to get distracted into this whole topic. When we say this physical object, right? I have a coffee mug. This coffee mug is a physical object. In Chassidus, this means that there is physical matter, right, to which a spiritual nature has been attached, or has been a spiritual nature. It's been imbued with a spiritual nature, right? For example, the blackness of the cup. The weight of the cup, right? Maybe the taste of the cup when I put it by my mouth, right? All of the qualities of the cup, other than its mere physicality, are spiritual, right? These are spiritual qualities. What's so rational about this? It's very simple. The only time those qualities are ever experienced is by a spiritual being, which is the soul, right? You'll say that it's experienced by a human being who is purely a being of matter. Chassidus would answer, that's ridiculous. The human being can't perceive anything without a soul, right? So you understand the two things go together. You see how these two whole worldviews form. There's one worldview, which in my opinion is totally irrational, actually absurd, which says that there's only physical matter, and the human being that perceives it is also only physical. The worldview of Chassidus and many other more ancient or older worldviews, in my opinion, wiser worldviews, say, on the contrary, the human being perceiving or knowing anything is fundamentally spiritual. There's something called the soul, which is spiritual, right? And its perceptions and its experiences in general are spiritual experiences. So when I experience this mug, what I am primarily experiencing is spiritual. Yes, there's also matter, which is very important. There's actual physical matter. This mug is not like the Pythagorean theorem or the concept of freedom, right? Which are spiritual entities, right? This mug is a physical entity. There's something called the physical world. There's something called physical matter, which is a very mysterious substance, by the way, a very mysterious thing, which we understand very little about in any form of knowledge, by the way. And there's Chassidus would say that's because it derives from the infinitude of God, which is totally inscrutable and unknowable. Just FYI. So there's a reason why it's so hard to understand what it is. Because all understanding is spiritual, the physical is physical, whatever. We'll get to all that in good time, hopefully, as we go through Tanya. So this physical object is actually, what we mean by a physical object, in fact, is a physical spiritual composite. A different way of saying all this that's maybe much simpler, which you can take away and remember much better, is in Chassidus, everything has a body and a soul. Everything that is created has both body and soul. Everything has a physical aspect, and everything has a spiritual aspect, right? The reason why I wanted to go into the more philosophical bend is to point out to you that the next point, which is that what we mean by a soul, right, is not something other than the physical object. It's not something like, when we say that the coffee mug has a soul, we don't mean really that there's something that you can't see that floats around here that is the special divine spark of the cup. Although to some extent maybe that's true as well, I don't know. But what we mean much more simply, to speak much more coarsely and straightforwardly, we mean simply It's part of the spiritual nature of the cup. In fact, it's just like when you meet a human being, right? A human being is a soul-body composite. A soul by itself is not a living human being, and a body by itself is not a living human being. A living human being, just a regular, what we would call a human being, is a soul-body composite. And when you meet another human being, right, you're not meeting a soul or a body. You're meeting soul and body together.
So what did you say? Actually, the blood of the...
We'll get there. 1 second. Very good. Good question. 1 second. We're getting there. Therefore, everything is a soul-body composite. The thing is, on the other hand, so that's on one side, soul and body are totally natural to each other, and in fact, everything that we perceive is both blended together. Actually, there's no such thing as matter by itself. By the way, long discussion. There's something called Chemer HaYuli, which is a discussion for a different time. We'll actually get there, but there's no such thing as pure matter, and pure spirit doesn't exist in the physical world, right? It's not physical, it's spiritual. So everything that you perceive in the physical world, right, is matter and spirit together. That's one side. Were you going to say something, Eric?
I was going to ask about the idea you mentioned in the concept of like Pythagorean theory, some of that.
Yeah.
There's only spirituality, there is no physical.
Correct, but it's not a physical object, it's spiritual.
So every physical object has both attributes.
Correct. In our physical world, right? Now that's interesting because the Pythagorean theorem interacts with our spiritual world, which is a whole question. It's a good point. Maybe connected to what I'm about to say, which is that there's a whole other side to this issue, which is that the spiritual and the physical are infinitely different one from the other. In fact, there is no conceivable way that the two of them should meet and become one being. It doesn't make any sense, right? How could a soul and a body ever become one whole being?
That's $1 million question.
Sorry?
That's $1 million question.
It is $1 million question, I agree. So in addition, like this, we say in Chassidus there's two things at work in making a soul and body come together, any soul and body, right? Including the human soul and body, which is what we're discussing, which the human soul is a special case, as we'll discuss, of soul and body. To make any soul and body come together, there's two things. There's number one, well, especially let's talk about the human soul. Maybe not every soul. To make the human soul and body come together into one being, into one human being, there's two things. There's something called the Keach HaMafli Lasos, which we discuss in Chassidus, which we mention in Asher Yatzar. After you use the bathroom, you make a bracha. You talk about Mafli Lasos, which means the wondrous maker, right? This refers in Chassidus to a particular infinite power of the divine to cross uncrossable gaps. Right? So in other words, in one sense, the spiritual and the physical cannot become one being, and God puts them together by force, which only God can do, because only God can cross an infinite gap. Right? That's one thing. There is a different aspect in which the soul and the body are made in the same form, so that when the two of them come together, they actually come together in a way that they're able to become one another, to meld and to mesh and join one another. For example, let's give an example right? You see with your physical eyeball. The soul has a capacity to see. Discussed at length in Chassidus. The soul, before it comes into the body, sees in a totally different way, right? Re'iyah is associated with Chachma. It's an aspect of wisdom. There's a way that the soul sees before it comes into the body and after it leaves the body, which is a much more spiritual. It has nothing to do with physically perceiving another object, because in the realms where the soul exists, there are no other objects. It's questionable whether there's objects at all. So what it means to see is a totally different type of thing, right? When the soul comes into the body, its ability to see is invested specifically in the eyeball, not in the foot, by the way. Specifically in the eyeball. The eyeball can see. And we say on the other side, the eyeball of the body is formed and made in such a way that it's able to let in light, right, and process it in a way that your foot doesn't at all, right? The eyeball, it's specifically the eye, which is able to let in light, right, and process it and send all the signals to the brain, etc., like you would hear in any anatomy class or whatever. So the soul has a capacity to see. That capacity to see is made coarser and coarser and coarser when the soul needs to come down into the body, until it's something like the soul's physical capacity to see, like I'm looking at you right now, like your soul is looking at me right now, right? And you have the physical eyeball, which is made in a very, very refined and precise way. It's a delicate piece of machinery, right, in a specific way that allows it to see, right? When the soul and the body are put together by God, in other words, it's not like just mushing two random things together. On the contrary, the two things are made to come together. The spiritual capacity to see is the soul, and the body, which is ready to see through a physical vessel, and the physical vessel of the eye is a physical vessel, but it's been made in a very, very, what we would say in Yiddish, edel. It's been made very refined. It's a delicate piece of machinery made for one specific purpose, and when the two come together, they're able to actually interact with each other. The final gap has to be crossed by God. In other words, it's not like the two of these things are ever going to go together without crossing that gap, because the true spiritual and the true physical don't really interact, right? So God has to close the gap, but when he closes the gap, and this is really the point of this whole discussion, when he closes the gap, the way they come together is in a way of what's called hislavshus, in clothing, which means that the soul becomes the very inner vitality of the body. A different way of saying in clothing is that the body's spiritual aspect and the soul's more physical aspects become one thing. They become indistinguishable from one another, right? So in other words, the soul is not like a little person that drives the body around like a big robot, like in the Japanese cartoons. That's not how the soul works, right? The soul is not a separate thing from the body when it's in the body. The soul and the body merge, so the soul becomes the inner vitality of the body.
The soul operates the body.
Sorry?
The soul operates the body.
In one sense, it operates the body. In a different sense, it is the body. Because the body, in other words, let's put it this way. There's no part of the body that you could zoom in on and not find the soul there. It's not like the soul is in one place and operates the body from there, like a person operating a machine, right? Every atom of the body is alive with the soul, right? The soul's vitality is in every part of the body, on one hand. On the other hand, it's not equally in every part of the body, right? Some parts of the body can see, other parts of the body can hear. So, yeah, right, absolutely. So there's different different purposes and different extents to which the soul is grounded in the body.
But that means that the soul resides on the head.
It's a complicated question because there's different ways in which it resides, and the answer is that I don't truly know the full answer to the question yet.
So I want to ask a simple answer about the cup. You take the handle of the cup.
Yeah.
What does it mean? What is its soul?
No, because the human soul is different.
No,
so here's,
how about the cup?
I know. So the answer is no, because it's not alive in the way that a human being's alive.
So what happens with the handle?
What do you mean?
Does it have its soul?
Yeah, of course. It has its own
Everything
soul.
that exists is soul.
What?
So it's not the soul of the cup.
What do you mean?
You can take the handle of the cup away and
Yeah.
break it.
Yeah.
Or even I can break the whole cup to pieces.
Yeah.
What happens with the soul of the cup?
That's a very good question. As I assume that the soul of the cup no longer exists where the cup was.
So the pieces exist.
Yes,
Right.
absolutely.
Yeah.
So in that case, I mean, the soul.
Anything that exists, if it was a cup with a handle or a cup without a handle, has a soul.
Okay, so I take the handle of the cup away.
Yeah.
I can still use the cup, so the cup
The
still
cup
has
still
that.
has a soul, and the handle.
Yes, the soul has
So then the soul splits.
the nature of it being a cup has.
You take a huge rock, you smash it into 1,000 pieces. Every one of that every stone as a piece of that soul.
It's not a piece of the soul, it has its own
It has its
soul.
own soul, yes.
No, but it's
But
the
it
same
does
soul.
split, it breaks into all those pieces. Yeah.
It's the same soul that actually not broke to many
No.
little souls. I mean, not little, but I mean,
הסול ברמה של הדומם זה הכוח המחיה. זה גורם לו להיות קיים, זה הכל.
But now that hijacked the whole process.
Right, but that means the soul of the cup is now disappeared.
If it's no longer, when it ceases to be a cup, is when the soul of the
No,
cup
but even if it's
disappears.
still a cup, the handle becomes a separate part, which has its own soul, which
Correct.
is part of the original soul.
That is correct.
It's almost like saying like every moment God continues to create, so that what was a couple seconds ago versus now, you can create.
That's also true. Very good. But there is two halves to this conversation. I probably didn't make it clear enough. There is two halves to this conversation, which are opposites. We're discussing two opposite things, and you have to understand both. Please silence your phones.
I did.
You have to understand both to understand what we're discussing in the Tanya right now. You have to understand both aspects. So there's two halves to this conversation. The two halves to the conversation that we discussed, there's 2 points here. I'm trying to make it as simple as I can. I'm worried that I overcomplicated it now. There's really two points here. There's two nakudas here. Number one, everything that's physical has a soul aspect. That's the first nakuda. The second nakuda, the second point here, is that when the human soul comes into the body, that is, although an additional thing to the body, right? A spiritual thing that's being added to the body. Nevertheless, it comes down and becomes unified with the body. So there's 2 points here. The first point is that everything physical has a soul, which means, let's put it this way to make it absolutely clear. The body, a moment after a person passes away, right? The body has a soul, because everything that exists has a soul. The same way the cup has a soul, right? But what soul does it have? It has the soul of a physical object called the body. That soul of the physical, and the body can still be warm, blood can still be flowing, but the person has passed away, right? It's a moment after they pass away, right?
Does it have a weight?
What?
Does it have a weight?
A
Yes,
weight?
there's 14 grams difference after a person dies.
I don't know. I don't know about the question of the weight. I'm vaguely familiar with what you're talking about, but I don't really know. So
It's heavier. 14
there's trying to keep my train of thought, if at all possible.
It's a complicated issue.
There's the body, a moment after a person passes away, is by all physical measures still alive, right? Which is why really you need a concept of the soul, because the whole physical concept of life versus death, there is no physical differentiator, right? Someone says the person is alive because the heart is beating or there's brain activity, and then they're dead when there's not, but that's not true, right? In terms of physical symptoms, so to speak, or physical evidence, there's a spectrum of sorts, right? And there's no one moment when the person passes away. And yet, in our experience, there is one moment when the person passes away, right?
Or finally passes away.
Right. Or not. I would have a rabbi that would say mother-in-law jokes at this point, but that's not. That's neither here nor there. There's a point where the person passes away. At that point, the body still exists. It has its own soul as a physical object. But the vital force, which is what we're discussing, right? The soul that makes the person alive, which is the divine I am that God creates. Let's put the things together now. God makes something that says I am. He makes a spiritual I am, which comes from the Klippa and Sitra Achra. That's why it says I am instead of God is, right? There's a spiritual I am which comes into the body and makes it alive. And that's what's left when the person has passed away. That's what's no longer there once the person has passed away. Now the point, when we say that this I am encloses in the blood, should now be understandable to us, right? What does it mean that this I am encloses itself in the blood? right? It means that the achiza, the stronghold, the place from which that soul becomes united with the body is specifically in the blood, right? And particularly, as explained elsewhere in Chassidus, the heat of the blood. If we could silence our cell phones, that would be
I
great.
did, I don't know.
The heat of the blood is considered to be, in Chassidus, the edelest part, the most refined part, the most delicate part of the body, right, is the actual heat in the blood. The heat in the blood is where the lowest part of the soul and the highest part of the body meet. But what I hope we've gotten from this discussion is the realization that the blood itself is spiritual. When we say the heat of the blood, we are describing a certain type of spiritual thing, right? Just like when you're discussing the eye, the eyeball, you're discussing something that also has spiritual aspects. The eyeball is a certain physical construction, right? And that physical construction is the spiritual aspect of the eyeball. That spiritual aspect of the eyeball is able to receive and convey the soul's ability to see. Yes? Just as we are saying here, the heat of the blood, which is the most spiritual aspect of the blood, right? The most spiritual aspect of the body in general, we say, is the heat of the blood. It's the most edel, it's the most ephemeral, it's the most non-physical, so to speak, part of the physical body. And that part receives the vitality of the soul that comes and is added to the non-living body that gives the person life. In other words, not just existence, the body already exists, it makes the person a living person.
It's very hard to understand absolutely because
Why?
Because you talk about the heat of the blood. If the blood is taken away from the body and warm it, does it make a difference? It's still like it's
No, but if you take an eye out of a person, it has a soul. It's still an eye,
every part, even
but
if you take
it's
a cell or
detached.
a vein.
It's detached from the livelihood of the body.
It's true, but when we talk about the heat of the blood, it's kind of hard for me to understand.
Why?
Because as I said, you take the blood away from the body, you put it in an oven and keep it warm. What does it mean? You have a warm blood, but it's meaningless to the body.
I agree. No, it has to be in the body, absolutely.
So the heat of the blood comes actually from the body itself, not from the blood.
I don't know where the heat comes from. I don't know if it's discussed in Chassidus, but to me it sounds somewhat circular, right? What makes it warm in the first place, right? It's a cycle. You're saying the body keeps the blood alive, but you could just as easily say the body keeps the blood keeps the body alive, right? It's a circular system, right? Everything is depending on everything else, right?
Ecosystem.
Which, on the contrary, is again one of the demonstrations and the idea of what the soul brings, right? Because circular explanations do not begin, if you understand what I'm saying. If everything is circular and all depends on everything else,
In the beginning, but maybe that's
right? How does the person become alive in the first place?
from the process of getting into the body and whatever.
No, I understand, but what is life, right? What does it mean that the person is alive?
That everything's synchronized.
Because there's lots of cycles and developments maybe before you would even say that the person is alive, etc. Whatever. So no, whatever. We won't get into all of that. Into the whole the process of birth and when life comes into the body. That's a whole other thing. The point we're making here, the point I would like you to understand for further, why is it worth discussing all of this, right? Are again the two things. Number one, everything physical has a spiritual aspect. In this case, we're saying that the heat of the blood is the most spiritual aspect of the body because it's ephemeral. In fact, you could argue that even in science's view, the heat of the blood is more energy than matter. It's not really a thing, right? It's more of something that a thing does, right? Like the motion of the molecules we say about heat and things like that, right? So it's not even a thing. It's actually something that a thing does, which is intriguing. It makes you think less physical, maybe more towards energy or the spiritual. that aspect receives, and the lowest aspect of the soul, which dwells within it. So the soul of the body receives the body of the soul, is actually the way you would put it, right? The most refined aspect of the body, the most spiritual, the least physical aspect of the body, receives the most physical aspect of the soul, the lowest and coarsest aspect of the soul. And the two, here's the point, the two are able to become one. Right? More or less. The two interact as if they are one being, right? The soul becomes the inner vitality of the physical body itself. So the soul is not, in the end of the day, it's not like a person operating a machine. It's also not like a battery. Some people like the metaphor of a battery, which is a very modern metaphor for the soul. It doesn't make any sense. The soul is not like a battery you put in the body. Maybe operating system would be a better way to describe it. It's like operating system, battery, it's a lot of things together, right? But why does the metaphor of a battery not make sense? Because the battery just causes the circuit to be alive with energy, and that circuit then is distributed and manipulates other things with that energy. But the energy at the end of the day is only in one particular place or one aspect of the thing that it's bringing to life, so to speak. Whereas the soul is not like that. The soul is not one source of vitality that is then spread out, so to speak, in this fashion to the whole person. On the contrary, the soul is in the form of the person. There is no aspect of the body which does not have an aspect of the soul that is vivifying it and making it alive and bringing it life. So it's not like a power source that is plugged into the person. On the contrary, every aspect of the person is alive, right? If you have a battery-operated watch and you cut into the band of the watch, you will not find any vitality from the battery, right? Because it's the band. There's no energy from the battery that goes there. A human being, every aspect of the human being, all the way down in every part of the human being, is alive with the vitality of the soul.
But the body has many souls.
Say again?
The body has many souls. We said the soul of the eye, the soul of the hand.
Yeah, absolutely. The body parts each have its own soul to a certain extent, right? They're all integrated into one being. But that's just the soul of the body by itself, without the soul that comes and gives it life, that makes it alive, with a human life, right? So what is, in the end, a human life? Right? In the simple understanding of Tanya, what we're saying here. It's a big question, but we'll give just a simple answer, right? The regular biological, what it means to be alive rather than a cadaver, right? What it means to be alive is that there is a godly I am, right? That has come and united with the physical body. That's what it means to be alive, right? And in fact, once again, this is a rational way to understand what a human being is, because if you think about it, literally everything about the human being, and to a certain extent science in its own backdoor fashion has discovered this as well, every aspect of the human being and their life is all arrayed around and an extension of the idea that I am. In other words, the I am is what unites and brings together every aspect of this body and soul, right? So in other words, from the growth of the smallest toenail, right, all the way up to the deepest thoughts that a person has, right, from the lowest and most physical to the highest and most spiritual within a human being, the biological life of the human being is all organized around this simple divine I am. Why?
What if a person is in a coma situation? He is completely not moving, no nothing. The only thing that works is his brain. Still alive?
What?
Comatose.
Is a comatose person still alive?
Yes.
I have no idea. You'd have to ask a doctor.
No, but I'm saying, I am.
What's a comatose?
In a coma. What?
The I am does not even exist.
Of course it does. Of course it does. That's what makes them one person, not another. That's what makes them one person and not the bed. How come you're happy to throw away the bed they're lying on, you're not happy to throw them away, right?
Because,
Yeah.
the chance maybe it's going to wake up.
No, I don't think so. I don't think that's why.
It's
Right?
alive. I mean,
What's the distinction?
definition of alive person,
What's the
brain doesn't
distinction
function.
between? What is the
Who tells you the
distinction?
brain doesn't function?
What is the
You see
distinction?
Wait, there are ways.
What is the
Is the brain
distinction?
not alive, the person not alive?
What is the distinction between the person and the bed that they're lying on? Right? One day soon, if the person passes away, there will be no distinction between them and the earth, pretty much.
Comes
What do you
back
mean?
for-
The person passes away,
Yeah.
you bury them in the ground.
Yes.
So one day there's not much difference between them and the earth. Where did the person go? There's just dirt here, right? There's no more or less, right? So, how come the person, when he's alive, right, there's a distinction between him and his surrounding. There's a difference between him and the stretcher, right? There's a long debate we could have about this. Is a whole class in and of itself. But at the end of the day, what I would try and argue, what I would try and explain, is the reason the person is different between their surroundings. They don't become the air, they don't become the stretcher, they won't become dirt even if you bury a person in sand at the beach, they don't become the dirt. Why? Because there is an organizing, perpetuating factor which holds all of their functions together, right? Even a person who's very ill, granted, maybe they don't have a lot of functions, right? I believe people who are in coma, their toenails still grow. No? Yeah, their hair still grows. Yeah? So all of their functions are organized and keeping them as one being. There is an I am which sustains this person. And in fact, the human I am is very much connected with its life. In other words, the body's soul, in fact, the body's soul alone is designed in a way that it's very, very temporary of living things. It's different than a stone. A stone can sit for 1,000 years and be the same. Whereas a human body doesn't work like that, which is the sign, by the way, that the soul just of the body by itself, even that is very different than the soul of a stone, right? It's something much more ephemeral. It's something much more fleeting, temporary, edel, right? Refined. It's not. It doesn't have the strength of the inanimate, really. Which is why the Rebbe Rashab says in a mimer, very interesting, I actually totally forget where, but I studied it once, that really fundamentally when a person passes away, if we really, really saw that if Hashem made the world to truly reflect the nature of the human soul and body, when a person passed away, they would just pop out of existence. They would just totally cease to exist, right? It's only because this wouldn't really be a purely physical world that God made it differently, that the body persists for a short amount of time after the person passes away. Yes, but really, if because the Rebbe Rashab's point there is that the entire existence of the body is really the soul that gives it life. It doesn't really have any purpose or existence outside of that, and every aspect of the body is made to obey the soul that gives it life. And so, really, if you the whole point that he's making there is really an Aveda point. The point is that we follow our body's desires all the time, which is absurd because the body only exists. The body is nothing. The soul is everything. So we shouldn't listen to the body at all. The body only exists here to convey the soul, right? But we get confused because we live in a world of darkness and a world of madness and absurdity, and so we get confused and follow our body's desires, right? The Rebbe Rashab's point is that if you could really see what independent reality the soul has from the body, you would see it has none whatsoever, even less than the way God made our world, where the body still persists after the soul passes away. There's one aspect, there's a tzad to say, there's room to say, that really when a person dies, the body should just pop out of existence as well, because the body is nothing, really, without the soul. Anyway, but that's all diversion. So, let's get back to, this has been a very wide-ranging, meandering class, hopefully not too confusing. The point is, the soul and the body become one. The most refined and spiritual aspect of the body receives the lowest aspect of the soul. This is called hislavshus, in clothing, right? The mistake not to make is to think of like a hand in a glove. It's not like a hand in a glove. A hand in a glove is not like a human being. A hand in a glove, there's a glove and a hand, and they're two separate things. Right? When we say in clothing, we mean one becomes the other. A better metaphor is like what?
Melding.
They're melding, but a better metaphor is, for example, A simple example is like a statue, right? If you see a carved statue by whoever, right? Michelangelo. Jews were not really big into statues. It's a good metaphor still, though, right? If you see a statue, right, where does the marble stop and the shape of the statue begin? And the answer is the whole question doesn't make sense. Really, we have the same metaphor in Chassidus from the carving of the luchos, which is a much more Jewish metaphor, right? That the luchos are carved with letters, but since more of us have seen statues than have seen the luchos, unfortunately, maybe that's a better metaphor. I don't know, but it's a less holy metaphor for sure. You see a statue that's carved in a certain form, where does the marble stop and the shape of the statue begin? And the answer is the whole concept is ridiculous. The form that was in the mind of the sculpture and the physical marble have come together to become one thing, which is the statue. That's hislavshus. That's what we mean by enclothing. The spiritual becomes the very inner vitality and nature, transformative nature from the inside of the physical thing. So the physical thing ceases to be just what it was before and becomes a living human being, soul and body together. Yes? So that's what we mean by hislavshus. Why?
Because what happens if the one who makes a sculpture dies? So he had it in mind that that stone is going to become like a sculpture, but he stopped to exist.
Yeah.
So, the stone still remains a stone.
That's it. The stone
I
is still a stone.
don't
It's not a
understand
statue.
it. Yeah, exactly. Correct. What's the problem?
Because, how do you define it? You said, the moment you think about that...
Not the moment he thinks about it, when he sculpts it, physically. Remember, the physical is not just physical. The physical is
So
spiritual.
when he took the chisel and hit it the first time, then it becomes a sculpture.
Maybe. Yeah, why not? If that's what he
is
wants
what
the
he
sculpt,
meant.
if that's what he wants the sculpture to look like, it's modern art. It's modern art.
Try to sell it.
It's like I went to a museum of modern art once, and they have there a white wall, and it's an art installation, a wall that's been shot with a BB gun one time. That's the name of the installation, right? So I guess if you call that art, why not? I couldn't find the dent. So yeah, if that was the sculpture's intent, the point is that a sculpture with its shape, right? The shape is no different than the sculpture. The shape and the sculpture are one thing, right? They're ein zach. They become one thing. It's not like a hand in a glove, right? The shape of the sculpture is the soul. The block of marble is the body, so to speak, right? And the two things come together to make a statue, right? And they become literally one thing. There's no distinguishing between the shape of the marble and the actual piece of the shape of the statue and the actual piece of marble, right?
Why should they have different soul? The stone has a soul, whether it's a sculpture or it's a stone.
I agree,
it's
but
the same
a
soul.
stone is not a sculpture.
But that's only
The idea of a sculpture is also not a sculpture.
No, but that's the way it looks. What does it make different whether it has one shape or another shape?
Oh, because that's a good question. It's a good question because it reflects a very modern way of thinking. Because the modern way of thinking says that if the stone sits in the shape of a sculpture, it's just stone sitting. And if the stone sits in the shape of just a block of stone, it's also just stone sitting. So what's the difference? The difference is that we don't think in that way. Chassidus doesn't see the world that way. Chassidus sees, when you see a sculpture, it sees an expression of the human soul that has been placed into a physical medium. So it's not just a piece of stone sitting. A piece of stone sitting doesn't become a sculpture, right? A human being he took his idea.
I don't define a sculpture. Like if the sculpture only made the head of the sculpture, he didn't finish what he wanted to do.
Yeah.
Is that a sculpture or?
Of course, it's an unfinished sculpture. His intention.
When does he finish it?
What?
When does he finish it?
I have no idea.
Then he wants the head.
I have no idea. We're
He
not
puts down
talking.
the chisel and he says done.
We're not talking about an idealized idea of a sculpture, as if the perfect sculpture exists somewhere.
He didn't finish it because of whatever.
That's what I'm saying. Is that there's no. It doesn't. What's the connection? Who cares? He didn't finish it. So what?
No, because you call it sculpture, maybe it's not a sculpture.
I don't understand what you're saying. A sculpture is a look it up in the dictionary, right? It's a physical medium that a human being took and shaped according to their intentions. That's a sculpture, right?
It's always in a state of change until
No,
finished.
I think the point is.
I don't see
The
the
point is when you look at a statue, that the marble and the shape of the statue are one.
correct. That's the point of
whole
that's the point of the metaphor of talking about the sculpture.
But the stone, the material is not the same the moment he the first hit with the chisel.
That is true, and therefore,
But it's still not called a sculpture.
why not?
Because this is not what his intention was. He wanted to make like a complete, whatever, shape, and he didn't make that shape here.
Right.
It's only like a process, like a person.
Sure.
Like a person.
So it's a process.
A human being in his mother womb.
No, we're not going back to that. It's a process of the sculpture, and therefore, why does it matter if it's a process for what we're saying? What does it matter?
Because I don't believe the stone change is soul. I think even if it's a sculpture, it still has the same soul as a stone.
No.
Whether you
Leonardo
use one way or
Michelangelo.
another,
No.
it is still the same material.
No,
It's the
incorrect.
chips in that, which now, according to what we said.
Incorrect. It's become a means of human expression, right? It's like saying a book with blank pages and a book with Moby Dick in it is the same thing, because it's both a book. It's both a physical object with paper. It's not true. It's not true at all. One is blank pages, and one conveys the soul of Herman Melville, or whatever he wanted to say. And you could say, did it become a book when he typed the first word, right? And the answer is I don't know, but that doesn't mean there's no difference
We
between...
talk about the book, let me talk about another book that we all know, the Torah.
Okay.
When does the Torah become holy? Actually, the time you put the siltut on it. That becomes, the moment you make it ready to become a Torah.
Okay. Therefore...
Therefore, it's like, everything is like, it's
So until it becomes a Torah, it has a soul of a parchment and some ink, and when it becomes a Torah, it becomes holy. Different soul.
There's lots of souls involved. If a soul means a spiritual quality of the thing, there's all sorts of souls involved. It's not such a black and white concept. But still, at the end of the day, if you have a sculpture, and that sculpture is conveying the vision of the one who sculpted it, who formed it, just like a book conveys the vision of the author who went and wrote in it, you have a physical medium conveying a spiritual thing. The sculpture is the better metaphor than the book for what we're trying to say, for various reasons, right? But you have the sculpture and the shape of the sculpture, which came from the soul of the sculptor, right? And that...
We'll be careful what if a computer made it.
What?
What if it was made by a computer? The sculpture.
I don't know. I don't see...
Discussion.
Not really, because a computer can't really make a sculpture in this sense. I don't mean physically. Physically, it could make a perfect replication of a sculpture, but it can't make a sculpture in this sense.
Computer can take
You're not listening. You're not listening to
think
me.
of a concept and turn it into
Of course.
A computer can't think.
Oh, be careful.
I'm not careful at all. I'm not afraid. A computer can't think, but that's a discussion for a different time.
AI, they can think deeply.
No,
Did you ever listen to two computers speaking to each other?
no, I never listened to it.
So you better. It's like, it's more than a human being speaking.
and if there's one
A computer can't.
Person.
It's very good. It's a very relevant topic to the Tanya, whether a computer can think. I will assure you that I'm not afraid to say that a computer can't think, but it's a discussion for a different time. Anyway, we're going very, very far afield here. What comes out from all of this? We see that the whole idea that the soul and the body affect each other, right, is built into Chassidus' worldview, right? In other words, that the soul should be unaffected by the body, right? The soul we're talking about right now should be unaffected by the body. Doesn't make any sense, right? Because the soul has become the inner vitality of the body, at least in its lowest aspect, right? It's involved in all aspects of the body. When your eye sees something, it's the soul that sees through the eye, right? So in other words, the soul is surely affected by anything that happens to the body. If God forbid something goes wrong with your eye, right, that soul is no longer able to see physically, right? It's no longer able to see in this world, see physical objects, right? So too with the brain, God forbid, or other parts of the body. And it's not just with something going wrong, but developmentally as well, of course, right? The brain of a child doesn't have the capacity to think as a more mature brain that's fully formed, etc., right? So on and so forth. And the physical form of the body and the shape of the body and the quality of the body, all of which is the spiritual aspect of the physical, by the way, affects the way that this soul is able to affect the world. And so to vice versa, the whole idea that the body should be unaffected by the soul also doesn't make sense. It's a two-way street, right? First of all, the body is alive because of the soul, which is quite primary, right? And the body is directed in many of its aspects by the soul, and even the aspects which are not consciously directed are powered by the vivifying force, the light and the vitality of the soul. And even in more refined aspects, right, such as the aspects of medicine that we're coming more and more around to appreciate, about how a person's mental state affects their physical health, etc., right? You see that the soul of the body, the vitality of the body, affects the body profoundly in many of these ways. So the whole idea that when we say soul, we mean something spiritual and like separate from the body. And when we say body, we mean something physical and separate from the soul. In Chassidus' view, these things are not true. These two things actually become one thing within the human being. So it's perfectly logical, and it makes sense that these two things should have profound interaction both ways, one and the other. So, in short, what we have here, what we're discussing in the first chapter of Tanya, is the human biological life that extends all the way from the growth of the smallest toenail all the way up to the highest and most refined and most profound thoughts in the mind of the human being, right? All of which stem from what? A spiritual I am that God creates. There is a spiritual I am, there is a spiritual existence that denies its grounding in God to become a separate, neutral existence, right? And that spiritual existence is what gives vitality to, not just in general, it doesn't just make the body alive, but it is the living aspect and lives the life of every aspect of the body, from the eye that sees, to the ear that hears, to the brain that's involved with thinking, right, etc. Every aspect of that body is alive in general and in particular from the divine I am. And this describes the first soul of the Jew. God willing, next week, I was hoping to do it this week, but we got into a very lively and enjoyable discussion. So next week, God willing, we will continue with the emotional attributes of this soul, and we'll move forward towards the end of chapter 1, which is a very deep and profound and interesting discussion. So we'll move on from here. We'll get into different types of klipa, different types of things that deny their existence in God, and the different ways they can be, and also the emotional effects that derive from this in the soul of the Jew, etc. And we'll continue moving forward in chapter 1 next week, God willing.
Well,
It's a very deep conversation, Tzvi,
Which one?
about thinking, computer thinking.
Why so deep?
Did you ever see a computer not printing, but writing a book?
In terms of like the AIs they have that can